Hello, this is Mark Tully, editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy, with another episode of Marksism with fellow editors and fellow Marks, Marc LiVecche and Marc Melton. We are discussing 3 articles from Providence this week, all of them about the Ukraine war, including an interview by Marc LiVecche with our contributor, Rebeccah Heinrichs, a reflection by Marc Melton on the limits of isolationism, and finally, 2 pieces by our contributor, Eric Patterson. But first, we'll go to Marc LiVecche and his conversation with Rebeccah Heinrichs on American interest and the Ukraine war. So, Marc LiVecche, fill us in.
Yeah, a little bit of an overview. Rebeccah and I spoke on first giving simply an update on where we are at this point in the conflict or in the war. I had Rebeccah specifically help us to sort through some of the frustrations I think that a lot of people are feeling in the deterrence scenarios as they play out in Ukraine. Everybody is very cognizant of the fact that Putin has a bomb, Putin most especially, and he's been using it to good advantage. And I think that's built some frustration that reminds us that there are limited things that we can do in the face of someone who has a bomb and may be willing to use at least theater-specific low-yield nuclear weapons, and sort of the shackles that puts us in. And then some of the questions that I put to her are, how do we reverse that trend? Can we get back on top of what's called the escalation dominance? Can right now it feels like we're on our back feet. Putin's the one deterring us. We're not deterring him. How can we reverse that without making the heavens fall? Right. So that's one of the primary questions. And then just moving through from there on predictions and a sense of where we are and how the American people ought to be thinking about this.
And Rebeccah, is she satisfied overall with U.S. policy towards the Ukraine war and the level of U.S. support for the Ukrainians against Russia?
Satisfied with U.S. policy, negative. Satisfied with the level of support, probably in many ways, yes. But there's things to criticize, right? Very pleased that there is a robust Western alliance building in support, or built and growing in support of Zelensky and the Ukrainians. Frustrated in some ways that Putin was able to start the war at the point at which he started it, meaning Ukraine should have been in a better position earlier on. We should have done more earlier on. And then frustrated in some ways with how with the perception, I think, that Biden has been essentially coerced into giving the support that he has given. He's slow rolled a lot of things. He's made some blunders along the way. It turned out to be a little bit funny. This is just identifying one source of frustration. In our conversation, which was prior to Biden's announcement of his new aid package, and the new aid package is certainly welcomed. But one of the things Rebeccah said is, I really hope he doesn't outline specifically exactly what it is that we're giving the Ukrainians. That's just, ambiguity works really well at certain instances in war. And lo and behold, he practically gave us an itemization all the way down. There were some things he left ambiguous, but it was a pretty astonishing, very detailed account of precisely what they're being given. So I'm sure that was a hair-pulling moment for Rebeccah. So mixed bag, generally not really happy, but had lots of good things to say.
And Marc Melton, regarding isolationism, about which you wrote, seemingly it's at a very low ebb right now, and there seems to be overwhelming American approval so far for strong support for the Ukrainians, including massive arms shipments. But tell us a little bit more about what you had to say.
Right. So this article, I look back at what an event that some of us attended that the American Conservative put on, where they talked about restraint and they talked about how the country was ready for moving toward a new foreign policy that would be restrained, isolationist, depending on your terminology. Those words can mean different things. But what Walter Russell Mead would probably say is that's a Jeffersonian model of foreign policy that would limit, be more minimalist. And so then this debate, you had two sides. One with a Notre Dame professor, can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he made the case of, oh, America's ready for this. And then you had a Leon Hader, who was Ron Paul's policy advisor when he ran for president, I think in 2008 or so. But he basically said, no, you cannot rely on the public. And I think that in hindsight, especially over the past few months, Hader was right. Like, if you're going to be isolationist, you cannot build your model on the public is going to support this, because the public is, some would say, erratic, and I will say that they're not erratic, or I'll explain why they're not erratic in a second, but they suddenly change their opinion a lot. And we see this, I've seen this multiple times in my life, but just considering the Ukrainian situation, we see massive change in the polls literally overnight. And this, I don't think, is surprising, because if you again go back to Walter Russell Mead's, his four schools, he talks about the Jacksonians. The Jacksonians are the ones who can appear isolationist, but if America itself is threatened, if American honor, exceptionalism, I can't remember all the different things that would cause them to rise up, but they can suddenly change their opinion, and they can be very bellicose. And so Hader quoted Walter Lippmann, if I can pull this quote up here, where he says that, the Americans are too pacifist in peace and too bellicose in war, too neutralist or appeasing in negotiations, or too intransigent. And so, in other words, like, Americans kind of can go to these edges. I don't think it's erratic, because erratic implies unpredictable. You can predict that the American public is going to change its opinion pretty rapidly, whenever stuff hits the news like this. And, in response, congressmen and senators are responding to this. You have congressmen who were kind of moving into an isolationist direction who have reversed course. For instance, I mentioned Josh Haley. He was a darling for some of these people in the restraint crowd, but he signed a letter that called on the president to deliver MiGs to Ukraine, Polish MiGs to Ukraine. And this upset some of the people, and there were some retweets and tweets that kind of linked to that, mentioned that. Also, one of the interesting things this past week that I don't mention because it was kind of after the fact, but so we have this Congressman Cawthorn who called Zelensky a thug. This is being shown on Russian state media. And, in America, we have free speech, so you can say these things. And, in Russia, I don't think anyone's going to be calling Vladimir Putin a thug and have it being shown on state TV. But in Russia, they're showing this video. But I noticed this morning that, this vote that they had yesterday in the Congress to remove Russia as a most favored nation. So in other words, we're going to basically put a lot of tariffs and other stuff onto Russia. Cawthorn actually voted yes. And so it's interesting, I think, seeing that shift here. And I think the reason why is because polls are showing that conservative Republicans are actually more hawkish on Russia than any of the other demographics, more so than moderate Republicans, moderate Democrats, and also kind of left-leaning Democrats. That being said, left-leaning Democrats are more hawkish on Russia than the moderates are. And so there's this wide bipartisan support for firmness with Russia. Now, how will this stand over the course of a year? Because I kind of think this war is going to last a while. I don't think there's really a peace deal. It would be good if there was a peace deal that would happen quickly, but I don't really see that happening. So I think that it'll be interesting to see over the course of a year, how does this public opinion hold? But if your foreign policy is built on the idea that you are going to expect politicians to ignore public anger, I don't think that's a viable foreign policy.
And finally, the piece is written by our contributor, Eric Patterson, on the necessity of resisting Russian aggression because, among other reasons, the precedent of allowing an aggressor to conquer another sovereign nation will obviously invite further aggressions by others. The classic lesson of appeasement, at least as it's been traditionally understood over the last 80 years. Any thoughts from you, Marc LiVecche?
Yeah, Eric Patterson takes an interesting turn in framing that argument. And he does so by looking at what's known as the use post-bellum phase of just war thinking. Use post-bellum, justice after war, is a proposed, if slightly controversial, at least among sort of just war eggheads. It's a controversial component of the just war tradition. What's controversial is not the idea that we should have justice after war, but whether or not it should be a third tacit category that one thinks through when they work through the just war framework. Patterson's position is pretty straightforward. It's essential because thinking about what comes after war is often neglected, and it's not properly accounted for in the regular criteria. And he posits that what has to be in place, or what ideally ought to be in place after war, are three basic things: order, justice, and conciliation or peace. And you see these three things built into the just war tradition in various ways. But here they are listed explicitly. And in the articles he gives us, we have, I think, first an introductory statement on the use post-bellum. And then he moves into a discussion of order, and then a discussion of justice. And I like both moves. He recognizes that order is an essential component of human flourishing. He recognizes, I think, a tension in that very often after war, you're never going to have an ideal, but it's important to know what you're striving toward. And he talks about the primacy of order, even in some sense, the primacy of order over even justice. And we've touched on this a couple times in the Marksisms, where we recognize that although ideally there are a variety of things we would love to be able to do to counter Putin, or looking at maybe the far off moment where the war is finally over, there are a number of things that we would love to be able to do to Putin: bring him to the Hague, try him, whatever it happens to be. This would be justice, and the yearning for justice is appropriate. Patterson recognizes that. The use post-bellum criteria recognizes that, but it also recognizes that order is essential, and that seeking the full measure of justice might actually compromise the ability to have order. I've sometimes phrased it like this: that order and justice together gives you peace, but recent history has demonstrated that if there is no order to begin with, at least an order without justice, or a full measure of justice, is better than anarchy. And so he's looking for ways for us to be able to move Ukraine from a place of anarchy, which might be Putin's at least short-term end game, to a place where Ukraine can actually have some structure and order, so that it can be, at least have the rudimentary requirements flourishing. So he looks at how some of that might be laid out. I think it's the second of, Melton can say better, but I think it's the second of three pieces. So he'll be fleshing out the final analysis in the next one.
Is there, Marc LiVecche, in terms of how we look at the Ukraine war, or more broadly, a tension or a gulf between Christian realism and just war teaching? And Eric here is trying to build a bridge between the two, or am I maybe exaggerating the differences?
Yeah, you touched on this last time, and I think I think it's an exaggerated difference, but I think you're touching on an important point. And I think last time I acknowledged the distance. On further thought, what I would like to say is I think the distinction, or that gulf that seems to be extant between just war thinking and Christian realism, is actually present in the just war framework. It's there, it's tacit to a degree, and I think it pays and will pay off significantly for us to further articulate that. So for one example, in the use ad bellum criteria, when is it right to fight, you have what is often understood to be two kinds of criteria. You have the deontic, or the deontological criteria of a proper authority, a just cause, and right intention. These three things have to be in place in order for a conflict to be considered justified. But even if you have a just cause, you then move into the prudential criteria. These are just the wisdom categories that help you decide whether or not, even though you have an apparent duty, whether or not you should try to carry that duty out. And these things are considerations like the probability of success. Do you actually have a chance of achieving your war aims? And then following that, proportionality of ends. By pursuing the end of this conflict, your war aims, are you likely to, on balance, achieve more good versus achieve more evil? And then you look at that in reverse. If you don't pursue the conflict, are you likely to achieve more goods versus evils? These are the prudential criteria. And I think Christian realism sits in that prudential section. The Christian realist will say to those who point out the just cause, fair enough, we have a just cause. We ought to go to war. And because of the reality on the ground, if we try to, the heavens will fall, or we'll simply make things worse, or we have no chance of achieving our aims. And so all we're going to do is contribute to the mayhem. So I think they're both there, but maybe tacit. And I think it's very important to tease those out. And you'll see those present in the in bello, how do you fight a war that's right to fight at the tactical level. And then you'll certainly see it in the post-bellum arena as well. I want Putin to pay. I want reparations. I want the whole thing. And it is almost certainly going to be crazy to try to force those things. It's a conflict of oughts. It's not a compromise of an ought. There are several requirements that are in tension, which is really how the moral life works, right? If we simply choose between right and wrong, that's easy for hopefully a Christian to choose. But here we've got competing goods, and we have to figure out, based on circumstances and consequences, how to adjudicate between those competing goods.
No doubt we will be exploring these issues further next week as this tragic and terrible war continues. Until then, thank you for listening to this latest episode of Marksism. Bye-bye.